welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely stunning book. I was gushing about it right before we started recording, and I am so excited to talk about it. So, welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hey, my name's Dylin Hardcastle. I'm an author from Australia, and my book, A Language of Limbs, which has just come out in the US, is a story that follows the almost intersecting lives of two young women over 30 years. The book's told in alternating chapters between limb 1 and limb 2, like a limb of your body. And in limb 1 story, a 15-year-old girl is caught with her neighbor who happens to be a girl in her garden shed when she's 15 in 1972 in Newcastle, and she's kicked out of home. And then in the same on the same night in Newcastle in 1972, in Limb 2's story, a 15-year-old girl wakes up from a dream she's had about her best friend that's having a sleepover, and she just turns the light on, looks at her friend asleep on the floor, turns the light off and goes back to sleep. And we follow these two unnamed protagonists over the next 30 years, one who's living this openly queer life and the other one who's desperately repressing her desires. And we follow them, I guess, through the almost intersections of their lives.
It is absolutely stunning. And the two different, gosh, they're just interwoven so beautifully, and they speak to each other in such interesting ways. And I have so many questions about how it manages to be so intimate and epic at the same time. But before I get into all that, could you just tell us a little bit about your writing career and the inception point for this novel?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm 31. My first book came out when I was 21, 10 years ago. And I've been writing, I guess, across the last 10 years. My books have been sort of published all around the world in a number of different languages. But the idea for this book in particular came in 2017. I was walking through Sydney CBD at night on my way to a gig, listening to music. And my friend and I had been joking at the time about how almost kissing is sometimes hotter than actually kissing. And I started to imagine what it could look like to have two lives sort of almost kissing over this course of an entire lifetime. And that was, I guess, sort of the beginnings, the very beginning of the idea for this.
Nice. Yeah, the parallel narrative structure, it's it's just so engaging, and it makes it, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. You want to like chew over it, but also, blaze through it at the same time because
Mhm.
it's just like you're really drawn to the book. I'm curious, yes, how much of it like explicitly written in dialogue, in dialogue with each other, and how much were the narratives, constructed in an isolated context, if that makes any sense at all.
No, I said for the first sort of 20 or maybe 20 or 30% of the book, I was writing the chapters alternating, back and forth. So I would write one of them one's chapters, then one of them two's, and back and forth. And then I sort of had this maybe 10,000 words in. Limb 1's story just really took off for me, which is the character that's living, the openly queer life. She ends up in a share house called Uranian House in Darlinghurst, which was kind of the sort of like queer heart of Sydney at the time. And was sort of the hotbed of a lot of the like activism that was happening in response to police brutality in the 70s. And then this house was sort of a stronghold in the height of the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And this story like really took off for me and felt so real and like fully realized and really complex and complicated. And so I actually ended up writing sort of the majority of Lim 1's story just like in one long tangent. And then I went back and filled in all of the sort of alternating chapters. And it was so interesting because when back to Lim 2, like I was so happy that I'd left her story for a period of time, because she, at this point in the story, had, without giving too much away, had ended up in Sydney studying at a like prestigious university with some college, meets a boy, gets married, and kind of, is doing all of the things that I guess, like by her mind, markers of a good and a quote unquote normal life. And there was just something about, I couldn't work out what the tension was, in the sense that I was like, I couldn't work out what the sort of like undercurrent of complexity in her life was. until there's like one relationship with her father-in-law that really sort of like once I worked out. So for anyone that has read the book, the situation with Morgan and Wales, that's all I'll say. As soon as I worked out that plot point, that whole side of the story just like shifted and became so real to me in my mind. And then I got really excited and went back and filled in all of those chapters. Yeah, and so for a while they were sort of alternating, but then I did sort of write most of them one and most of them two, like at the same together. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about, but it's very interesting. So one of the things that I love that you really get from, the parallel structure that lets you compare their journeys is that you get like this really nuanced understanding of queer identity as both sort of an internal phenomenon about like an internal orientation and about like your social orientation in the world and your social context and your historical and cultural context and all these different things. How do you how do you balance like the story and I guess that, yeah, how their stories shape their identity?
Mm. This is interesting because it was something that I was thinking about so much whilst writing it, where, my friends, particularly those within the LGBTQI plus community here in Sydney, have really taught me that community is a verb. And, I really imagine queerness as an action, and as a politic and as this like ongoing doing, and that, I am like part of a queer community because of the way that I participate in it, as opposed to it sort of being something that is like bought into with, in a noun in some sense, that I like say that this is a thing. And yet, that's also not, that always sits alongside these, internal feelings and impulses and deep knowings of who we are and who we want to be and who we might become. And and so there was something, as you say, like that was really productive, I think, about this book in allowing me to sort of explore the complexities of like the repression versus this like living this openly, queer life. Because, in many ways, the character that is out, her life outwardly is much more difficult, in terms of like material limitations on her life. Like work is much more precarious, housing's more precarious. There's like so much police brutality happening. Homosexuality is not decriminalized yet in the 70s. And, that like outwardly that her life looks much more difficult. And there are like these, really complex hardships, but then internally within Uranian House, this like you see the way these people are like built up from the inside by this like chosen family, by this sort of like collectivity and like the coming together and the like showing up and saving each other in small and big ways continuously throughout the book. Whereas in Lim Chu's story, outwardly her life is much more, she's able to finish school, she gets the scholarship to university, she like gets married, all of these like markers, as I said, of a quote unquote good and normal life. But inwardly she's sort of like, I feel like tormented is too strong a word, because she lives a very fully realized life, I think, in spite of that repression. But there is this like sort of constant hum to her experience that sort of underscores her side of the book. And I think that the position that I really tried to take as well, because I don't have a position on it, was like to be one of being quite neutral, of like neither one of these is the right way. Like the book kind of explores the weight of a choice, but the choice, we arrive where we're supposed to arrive no matter what choice we make. And I really believe that. And so, there was something quite liberating, I think, about being able to write this story and have not take a side, or like, I mean, at least I hope that hasn't come through like I've done that, because I really don't feel like one, was like it was a moral choice in any way. I don't think one was more fitting, or like a better life, or a better, like more brave even. Like I don't, I was very neutral, and these are just two ways a life could unfold.
Yeah, the book very much feels like equally compassionate and understanding of both arcs, And that did make me think again of my point about how it manages to feel so, intimate and epic at the same time, because you have these like very nuanced internal journeys, and they are like grounded in a very real like historical moment over moments over a few decades that are really fleshed out and evocative. So I'm curious about like, did you do a lot of research for the historical element and bringing those past periods alive?
Yeah, I see it. There's a group here called Pride History Group that is a collective of older activists who were like, many of the people that this story is inspired by, who were sort of on the front lines in the 70s and 80s here in Australia. And yeah, they have this amazing online archive and sort of like online repository of stories where they've interviewed so many people that were there at the time, and basically just started this oral history recordings in to archive their experiences in the 90s, I think, sort of, in the wake, or not in the wake of, but at the height of the AIDS crisis as it was playing out here in this country, and wanted to preserve and record their histories and their friends and their stories. And that has now turned into this 20-year long, or even longer now, I think, project where, yeah, they've just documented so much information, and they also documented a lot of like imagery from not only from protests but also from like club scenes, and yeah, all kinds of different venues that and pubs that were queer spaces at the time. And so I like sort of trawled through their repository, and then yeah, that was kind of like, that was my entry point, was going through Pride History Group's sort of archives. And I mean, there was one amazing curator I spoke to also at the Archive of New South Wales, who sort of took me through some of those like old photos that they had in the collection there. And it was very funny because he was showing me one photo of all of these men in leather out the front of a pub in the 1960s. And, he was saying like, oh, this has been like documented in the archive as a bikie gang. And then he said, do you notice there's no motorcycles? And there's like 50 people or 50 men dressed in leather on the like side of this street all drinking beer. And he was like, where are the motorcycles? And I just thought it was so beautiful and such a like incredible. And so much of the research was like that, where I was like, oh, this is, you know, the ways that people have communicated and sort of, very much been hidden in plain sight, where, yeah, it's not super overt. And it was, yeah, it was like, I guess a lot of these communities were obvious to anyone that was in the know, and to anyone that's not in the know, it's a bicycle gang. Like, yeah. And so yeah, that kind of research was a lot of fun. And then I think, ultimately I'm in relationship with a lot of friends that were living at that time. The queer community in Sydney is so intergenerational. I don't know if it's because we're like, a much smaller population here than you would be in the States, but I'm often partying on or dancing on dance floors with people that are in their 60s who were actually, present for a lot of the moments that I was writing about. And so I felt very lucky to be able to not only have deep conversations with them, but actually do consultation and have them, read and edit and give notes, and yeah, sort of help me to capture the essence of the time in that way.
Oh, it's so lovely.
Mm.
Yeah, and that speaks to, I think, the themes of, found family and chosen family as well, because you do need to rely on those sort of networks in order to find out where that bar is and, how
Mm.
to get in and all those things. It reminds me of a moment at Uranian House too that sort of connects all that with like the history aspect too. I can't remember who it is now, but one of the characters gave Lim one like a history text or a history book and
Mm.
was like, we've always been here, and sort of that like that belonging, not just like in space, but over time.
Totally. Yeah, yeah, that's Jeff, who's the professor, gives, yeah, yeah, the art professor. Yeah, yeah, he gives them one, yeah, art history book on surrealism. I love that. That's, yeah, such a beautiful sentiment, because it's so true. We are like anchored, yeah, not only in like physical places, but like across time.
Hmm.
Yeah. Hidden, or not even hidden in the margins. Like so often it's just like you're just hidden in plain sight. And it is actually quite obvious to anyone that's in the know, and then you just sort of sail through otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What also really interested me about Uranian House was that you saw a lot of like collaboration with other movements. Like there were signs for Aboriginal rights, the women's lib movement, and student movements. Did you research into that as well? Like, how did you find out about those connections?
Yeah, so the history of this activist spaces, like a lot of the early, like so our first big protest was called, or one of the big protests that now has become, this kind of institution, is Mardi Gras. And Mardi Gras is now this, parade that's live streamed on TV, and it's, one of the sort of like premier LGBTQI plus, I don't know, I guess, yeah, parades or shows in the world. And it's a huge parade that goes up Oxford Street every year in March or the end of February. And that was originally like the very first Mardi Gras was actually put on to commemorate Stonewall in the US and to respond to the like escalations in police brutality on the ground here in Sydney. It was on Gadigal country, and the like sort of coming together or coalition of and like sex workers and Aboriginal or like First Nations people here on this continent who were like being targeted by police, but also like homosexual and queer people that were also being targeted by police. And so the kind of response to that was Mardi Gras, and it was this coalition of predominantly sex workers, First Nations folk, and queer people, and the like coming together of those groups, which the Venn diagram, also has like a big crossover in the middle. And so one of a lot of the early chants that they were doing were like reflective of that coalition. And then also, I mean, for anyone that doesn't know the history of that first Mardi Gras, 1978, the party started as an attempt to get people out of the bars and onto the streets, because the sentiment being that, we have this like vibrant, alive, deeply colorful and exciting community inside the bars, and our outward facing, the public is coming into contact with us whenever we're in protest and whenever we're angry, and like let's show them how glorious the insides and underbellies of our spaces are. And so they actually just partied down Oxford Street, this like sort of truck, a truck that had a big speaker on the back of it, and we're just encouraging people to come out of the bars and onto the streets, quite literally. And they eventually made it to Hyde Park, which is sort of this park at the foot of Oxford Street in the middle of Sydney. And then the police turned up and they sort of herded everyone up William Street to where, a number of police had taken off their badges, and it turned into this, or devolved into like absolute chaos and became a bloodbath. And over 53 people were arrested overnight, and thrown in Darlinghurst police station. And they were the Sydney Morning Herald, which was like, the biggest newspaper in Sydney at the time, published the names and addresses and occupations of everyone that was arrested. And so you had people that, were not out to their families, let alone to in their work life, or, being evicted, losing their jobs, losing their families. Like it was horrendous. And that, but that is the beginning of Mardi Gras. And it was also really interesting, I guess, learning about this coalition and the solidarity across a number of different like factions of marginalized communities, and to really understand and land in that sort of like collective struggle for liberation, and which very much still exists here, and I know exists all over the world today.
So interesting. And it's really emblematic, I think, of, the broad range of sort of emotional experiences you get from the novel as well, because there is like a lot of hardship and conflict and there's pain, but ultimately it is like it's a celebration and it's like full of joy too. And that's like a really lovely balance that you manage there.
Thank you. Yeah, that was one thing that I really was like, I guess not only just from a craft point of view, to have levity so that you can go to really dark places, and to have comic relief and like more joyous moments, so that those like I guess to offset just from a purely craft point of view. But also then I was like, I can't not write the joy, because that feels so true to my experience of my friends. And I see the ways that their like intense zest for life and their intense like joy and passion and like coming together and excitement are ruptures to otherwise difficult experiences. And like the sort of dance floors, I think, do serve such a purpose, because they are these like breaks, or like circuit breaks, where like not only can you like move tension through your body and like release it, but also I guess like have these ruptures so that the then like work outside of the club feels sustainable again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sustains the work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been so fascinating, and I'm so grateful for your time. To the extent that you are able to talk about it, what's next for you? Are you writing right now, or?
Yeah, I've actually just started a few weeks ago my next novel, but it is the first time I've actually like really fleshed it out in my mind. I've sort of been thinking about this book for 2 years, and it's the most fully realized, I think. Not often I'm sort of have like major plot points sort of mapped in my head, but like the in-between moments less so. whereas this book just feels so alive in me. I honestly feel like I'm ready to like, I'm just about to like press like download it. It's just gonna like out of my, out of my mouth and then gonna land on the page, which I think in some sense is what how it's feeling as it's coming out, like out of me. But yeah, it's been really fun. It's definitely actually a bigger, even bigger scope than A Language of Limbs. It goes across the entire 20th century. So there's requiring an enormous amount of research, but it's inspired by my great uncle, Doug, who is this beautiful gay man who passed away last year, but he was 97, was a window dresser at David Jones, which is like our flagship sort of department store, the really bougie department store in Sydney. He was the window dresser at David Jones for 45 years. So it was just like so stylish and amazing. And a poet and a writer. I loved the ballet and the opera. And I'm writing this story about a love affair between an opera singer and the wife of a cricket player, where the two women meet up whenever the Ashes is on, which is like a cricket tournament between Australia and England. And so, yeah, I'm interested in writing this kind of hyper masculine cricket Australia to the backdrop of queer opera is the vibe.
Oh, that sounds great. Oh my gosh. Well, Godspeed. Happy writing. That sounds fantastic. And yeah, I loved reading this one and I can't wait to read that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out A Language of Limbs. It's available now. It'll be available when you hear this. So head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for books. Okay, it's time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.